Being a Sega fan could be rough at times. Its history is fraught with decisions that often left the company in some pretty bad situations. Surprisingly, many of those times didn't directly affect their customers the same way. The Saturn showing up early in North America is often considered one of Sega's biggest mistakes, but at the time, I was happy to see it. It meant the 32-bit generation was truly underway, and I was about to get even more great games to play. That doesn't mean that Sega didn't let me down at times, however, and that's the basis of the video you're about to watch. I have chosen 10 times that Sega went in a completely different direction than I wanted them to over the years. It ranges from simple stuff most of you won't care about to things that affected a great many of us. Of course, in the end, it's all about the simple fun of sharing some of my biggest disappointments. I hope you guys enjoy 10 times Sega really let me down. The phenomena of the mini system may surprise some of you, but they are a modern doorway to older games that carry with it a legitimacy of being associated with the company originally responsible for the product to begin with. They often come in similar packaging as the originals, carry with it all the logos and designs you remember, and have some of the better games that were available for that platform. They are plug and play and require nothing from the end user to set up and start enjoying their favorite games. So when Sega announced the Sega Genesis Mini, I was a little confused as to why they completely skipped the Master System in the lead-up. Aside from the obvious popularity of such a unit in Europe, retro gamers have proven a taste for these devices despite their original sales performance. For example, the TurboGrafx Mini sold extremely well in North America, even though the original Turbo was a complete failure. I also feel it was a missed opportunity to do some really neat stuff. Sega could have loaded games from different regions so you could see how they differed from one another, and even included the FM soundtracks for those that supported them. All that takes a backseat to the fact the Sega Master System actually has a great library of games to pull from. Sega could have introduced its classics to an entirely new generation. Of course, the funny thing is that Tectoy has essentially been doing this for years, so the blueprint for any possible design was already there. Sega has such a wealth of history it doesn't seem to know what to do with, and seeing this fine platform get passed over again and again has always disappointed me. The Dreamcast Gun is one of the strangest instances of a regional lockout you'll ever see. In March of 1999, alongside the Japanese release of House of the Dead 2, Sega releases its official light gun for the Japanese Dreamcast. It was accurate and aesthetically pleasing, making it a great successor to the Saturn's Virtua gun. Shortly thereafter, the Columbine shootings take place in the United States, and Sega decides it will not be releasing a Dreamcast gun in that region. Instead, we got this hunk of shit from Mad Catz, the Dream Blaster. It didn't look nearly as nice, nor was it as comfortable to hold. But that wasn't the problem. In Sega's infinite wisdom, they didn't want people importing the original Japanese Dreamcast gun for US software, so nearly all the light gun-based games in the United States dropped support for it. This left many of us that had imported and/or preferred the Japanese gun no option to play the US software with it. I mean, I understand that Sega didn't want a realistic-looking gun at a time of great social attention to gun violence, but to actually remove compatibility from games was downright sinister. There were other third-party options, of course, but not being able to use the officially licensed Sega gun with US software always rubbed me the wrong way. When the Saturn was launched, I was sure of two things. One, Sega had an uphill fight coming against Sony, and two, Sega would finally release some of its System 32 arcade classics like OutRun and Golden Axe: The Revenge of Death Adder. I mean, the Saturn was made for these kinds of games, so Sega would surely grace such a 2D powerhouse with some of their better arcade games, right? As it turns out, not only did Sega not do that, but they decided to develop a completely different Golden Axe title altogether. While this wasn't a bad game taken on its own, it was no Revenge of Death Adder. While 3D games were all the rage at the time, I was still shocked that there was no Japanese version of either of these titles. This would become one of my greatest disappointments with Sega over the years. Not only did most System 32 games skip the Saturn, but they skipped the Dreamcast as well, a system that could have done them even easier and had the 4 controller ports to accommodate its co-op gameplay. Arcade quality versions of Revenge of Death Adder and Outrunners would never grace any of Sega's platforms, and we would only ever receive them in emulation form on secondary products like the Astro City Mini and the Arcade 1-Up devices. It could be argued that the entire existence of the 32X was a letdown, but there was one game I wanted so bad after seeing what Space Harrier and Afterburner accomplished, and that was OutRun. Even cut back to 30 frames per second, I think this could have been a great one to show off what the 32X could do. It wouldn't have changed the platform's fate, but it would have made for a great thank you to those of us that adopted Sega's mushroom-shaped 32-bit alternative. To add to the bitter disappointment, I learned years later that OutRun had actually been considered for the 32X, but never made it into full development. Sega's platforms often suffered a case of the what could have beens, but I think OutRun would have been right at home on the 32X. At that point, we didn't have anything close to an arcade-perfect version of it, and it could have been a bright shining light in an otherwise dreadfully dark 32X future. You've heard me praise Skies of Arcadia in the past. It's one of my favorite Sega games, and I own both the Dreamcast and the GameCube versions of it. As Sega switched gears to a third-party developer, I thought for sure it would get ported to everything under the sun and a sequel would be finished up in no time. I had adored its sci-fi world of floating islands, pirates, and oppressive regimes. The people of Skies of Arcadia were so lovable and relatable, I was more than happy to be a part of their journey. But things didn't go as planned. While I thought it was one of their better games back then, it apparently sold terrible on both the Dreamcast and GameCube, forcing a planned PS2 release into cancellation, and Skies of Arcadia 2 to never happen. This sent the franchise into permanent hibernation that has lasted the last 20 years now. This great game deserves so much better, and it's high time Sega turned the IP over to a studio that has the passion to bring this world back to life.
Moons, give me strength!
That was fun!
We are all aware of the way the Dreamcast went out back in 2001. Sega announced that it would stop production and it would be switching over to a third-party developer and publisher. This never set right with me, particularly since the machine had only been released a year and a half earlier in the West. Games did see release in the US for another year or so, but this was a little consolation, seeing as how Japan received games regularly until 2004, and then periodically all the way to 2007. This was one bitter-ass pill to swallow, considering North America had been the system's best-selling region, accounting for half of its 10 million installed base alone. I realized Sega had to go third-party to survive. It had to be done. But there was no reason to completely abandon those of us that had supported their last hurrah. They already had their engines done for their sports games. Where was NFL and NBA 2K3? Why didn't they license any of the Japanese releases for the US after 2001? Hell, Sega was even directly involved with the Atomiswave platform. Why weren't any of those games brought home since the hardware was virtually identical? Again, I understand that Sega had to cease production of the Dreamcast and go third party, but to once again leave those of us that had put their money and faith into their brand was a really low point in my fandom. Sega even did some little things that really bothered me. For years, they graced us with the plastic clamshell cases for the Sega Master System, Mega Drive, and Genesis. It was one of the best packages any company had ever given a fan base to protect their games. Seeing a solid collection of Genesis games on a shelf is a beautiful thing, but at some point around 1994, Sega decided to fully switch over to cardboard boxes for their Genesis releases. This wasn't the first time this annoyance had touched the mighty Genesis, as Electronic Arts and a few other companies did it early in the console's life. But this change had come on a much grander scale and affected every release after it started. The loss of the hard-shell plastic case cannot be stressed enough. It's felt even now, particularly with collectors. You'll have this beautiful set of cases on one shelf and then some manky-ass old beat-up boxes on another. Many of these cardboard boxes did not survive in good condition, and you will often have trouble finding these games complete. Of the small changes Sega would make during the life of the Genesis, this one really sucked. When Sega released Panzer Dragoon Saga, I was really excited to play it. I had really enjoyed the first two games. They had taken the rail shooter concept to new heights, and they had some of the best music of any video game I had heard at that point. But Sega and Team Andromeda had radically changed what the series was all about with Saga, leading to my incredible disappointment. I had not wanted this change and preferred the series to stay action-oriented instead of this new direction of random battles and long cutscenes. Growing up, action games had always been my first choice, and that's what I always gravitated towards. I had always wanted to see a third-generation Panzer engine, since the first two had been some of the better-looking titles at the time of their release. I want to be clear that it didn't have anything to do with the quality of Saga as it was, it's just not the Panzer game I wanted. Even to this day, it doesn't feel quite like the same universe, flying around freely and being bombarded with random battles again and again. Panzer Dragoon Orta would return the series back to the kind of game I wanted, but it was a 6-year wait to see it happen. I know Saga has its fans and I really appreciate that, but I wanted Sega to let the series run its course on the Saturn and let Saga begin anew on the Dreamcast. The lead up to the release of the Sega CD had been huge. The Genesis was enjoying enormous success in North America, and the promise of even better games was quite enticing. Gaming magazines touted its extra Motorola 16-bit CPU that was even faster than the one already in the Genesis. They told about features like sprite and background scaling and rotation to rival arcade platforms. And of course the CD storage space to make it all come together in a way we had never seen home games before. The cruel reality was that Sega rarely ever touched all that extra hardware. Fascinated with full motion video, they pushed interactive software over traditional gaming experiences. Instead of brand new games with radical new approaches, we got ports of cartridge games with an extra level or two and some CD sound. The thing is, it was all that extra hardware that had made the Sega CD so expensive in the first place. By the time the US version rolled out in 1992 for $300, the Turbo CD retailed for only half that at $150. This really does beg the question, why the hell did Sega put all that extra hardware in the unit only to not use it? This question has haunted me for years and is one of my biggest letdowns during the 16-bit era. The Sega CD really needed its own identity, especially at the price point Sega was pushing it for. Looking at the library we did get, nearly all of it could have been done without all that extra hardware cost Sega put into the unit. It's a brutal reminder that sometimes Sega did things that simply made no sense at all. Of all the things Sega did during its hardware days that really crushed my expectations, it was the cancellation of Virtua Fighter 3 that was perhaps the most memorable. Sega officially announced that Virtua Fighter 3 was in development for the Saturn at E3 in the spring of 1996. The main man Yu Suzuki himself said Sega was well in development of the title a few months later, and I was so ready to have a home version of it. The messaging began to become really clouded as time passed, however. At first it was just going to be a regular Saturn game like Virtua Fighter 2, but then you started to read about an accelerator cartridge to help the Saturn push more polygons. You knew things were in trouble by mid-1997. The proposed Christmas release date was a mere 6 months away, and Sega had stopped talking about the project completely. Once word of the Dreamcast caught fire, all hope was lost. The thing is, I didn't need an add-on card or anything of the kind. I just wanted a solid translation of the gameplay and a third-generation graphics engine that saw some noticeable improvements. That pill was made even more bitter by the showing of Last Bronx in late 1997. It sported a high-res engine at 60 frames per second and extensive use of VDP2 to create 3D-like backgrounds. It was absolutely clear that the Saturn could have done a unique port of Virtua Fighter 3 that could have still been impressive. The gameplay was the most important part, and Sega AM3 had made it clear that there were plenty of tricks left in VDP2's basket. Virtua Fighter 3's cancellation also ties directly into my desire to see the Saturn architecture really be pushed to the edge. I wanted to see what developers had learned from their earlier games and how all those extra chips could work together to show the platform at its best. AM2 were brilliant developers, and I just know they could have done something special. A list like this is going to be very different person to person. Depending on the type of games you like, the region you were in, and the timetable in which you experienced it all, your list is likely nothing like mine. Part of the reason I wanted to do this episode is so I could hear your biggest letdowns and how they affected you. In fact, I would love to do a viewer edition of this topic in the near future, so please feel free to share your reasons down in the comments. It didn't always have to be something major, as some of life's most potent letdowns happen to be the smallest things. As Sega fans, I'm sure you all have many stories to tell, and I'm gonna try and read every comment. In the meantime, I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.